Diablo State Park was established in 1921, but the mountain has been important to humans for thousands of years.
We're taught that there was a time of a great flood, when everything in the world was covered with water, except for the two peaks of the mountain that's right behind us, Tushtak. When the waters receded, our Creator created the world as we know it today. But we're taught that we're supposed to tend to this, take care of it, steward it. This is our most sacred peak.
Starting in the late 1700s, the Spanish and later Mexicans and Americans brutally forced native peoples off the lands around Mount Diablo and elsewhere. Disease and persecution almost wiped them out, along with their languages, religion, and culture of caring for the land. But some managed to survive, and their descendants still revere the mountain today.
The first overland immigrant party headed to Mount Diablo. They were using newspaper accounts from Dr. John Marsh, the first American settler in Contra Costa County. In those accounts that he'd send back to newspapers in the East and the Midwest, he would describe how to get to the Bay Area across the Sierra. Well, this was ironic because Dr. John Marsh had never crossed the Sierra. In fact, no one but a few fur trappers and Native Americans had. The thing he got completely right was, when you get across the Sierra, look for the double pyramid peak off in the west, and my ranch will be found at the base of Mount Diablo. So it was important in terms of guiding people. You can still see it from half of California, which is why it was chosen as the initial point for California's first baseline and meridian. If you own property in most of northern and central California, your property lines are based on those initial north-south meridian and east-west baselines from the peak of Mount Diablo.
Mount Diablo is located right at this point between the Bay Area and the Central Valley, between the coast and the delta. As the mountain rose and things disappeared from the area around it, it retained things that you normally associate with wetter Pacific Northwest climates to the north. Then it retained things that you normally associate with the Mojave Desert to the south. And it's the northernmost location for coulter pines, which are generally found 200 miles south in Southern California. But it's also a center of endemism. You have plants that have evolved into new forms as they survived on Mount Diablo. The Mount Diablo fairy lantern is the most obvious example. So Mount Diablo is just an amazingly rich place. It's a reservoir of biodiversity, and it's an incredibly interesting place as a result, too.
In the late 1700s, when the Spanish came north along the coast, they brought food with them in the shape of cattle. That was the beginning of a slow but revolutionary change in the mountain's ecology. The change was not only caused by what the cattle ate, but also by the non-native grass seeds the cattle brought in on their hides. As more colonists flooded into California, more foreign seeds came in too, in the ballast of ships and in loads of grain. By the middle of the 20th century, in many places, bunch grasses had been replaced by non-native annual grasses with much shorter roots.
And the big change was to the hydrology of the mountain. The native bunch grasses allowed the water to be released slowly into the creeks and streams, so they ran late into the year. But with the annual non-natives, the runoff was great. Every time it rained, down came the water into the creeks carrying mud and sediment. So that had a very negative impact on the aquatic life on Mount Diablo. The cattle have been gone since the late 1990s with a change in park policy. That's brought in some new problems. There was a fear that our ground squirrel population would evacuate the park. Ground squirrels like grazed grass so they can see predators. And ground squirrels are a keystone species. Raptors depend on them for food, and the mammal carnivores depend on them, and also animals lower on the food web. They use ground squirrel burrows in the summer as refuge.
The jury is still out on that, In some areas, ground squirrels are still common. In others, they have completely disappeared, but we don't know why. Naturalist Michael Marchiano worked on one of Mount Diablo's cattle ranches in the early 1970s. It's not a working operation today, but you can still see its buildings as you drive up Northgate Road. Marchiano recalls asking the ranch's owner, Angel Curley, if she might want to cut down some oaks to make more land for grazing.
She looked at me and she says, "Michael," she says, "let me explain something to you. I am very fortunate to be able to own a place like this and to have all this land here." She said, "I love it. It's important for me to protect it. And I'll never forget that state of my mind that you have to be stewards of these lands. And even a person that might have occasionally poisoned ground squirrels around certain areas, or would have maybe shot a coyote if it felt it was destroying one of their cattle, that type of a person still believed in protecting it."
In the 1870s, a mountain guide and developer named Joseph C.V. Hall came out west. He was famous for his work on Mount Washington in New Hampshire. But now his sights were set on Mount Diablo, which he said had more rare attractions to the lover of nature and fine mountain scenery than any mountain of the same altitude, perhaps in the world. By the spring of 1874, Hall and his business partners had built 2 toll roads up the mountain, one from the north, the other from the south. The newly accessible mountain was a big hit. Some 800 people paid the 25-cent toll in the first month. Hall added an observatory with a telescope at the top and constructed a 16-room hotel, originally called Toll House, later called Mountain House, 2 miles below it. A man named Seeley Bennett started taking people up to Mountain House in an open stage.
It was very popular. People would come there not only to stay overnight and see Mount Diablo. They came up for weddings and for christenings. And they got water from a nearby spring, delicious fresh water. And the story goes that spring disappeared with the San Francisco earthquake in April 1906.
Mount Diablo's ranchers were never really comfortable with people traveling through their grazing land to get to this hotel.
They blamed them for scaring the cattle and starting fires. So they took this opportunity to petition the Contra Costa Board of Supervisors to close the roads in 1895. And after that, well, you could still get there, but you had to walk up, and the only people intrepid enough to walk up were graduate students from UC Berkeley who made the trek every year. In 1901, the mountain house mysteriously burned. The ranchers were always suspected of having precipitated the fire, but nothing could ever be proved. The one mysterious thing, when they went to visit the smoldering ruins of the mountain house, was the doors and the windows were found in a creek bed. And that remained a mystery for several decades until finally one of the ranch hands on his deathbed fessed up. He said, "Yes, we indeed had burned down the mountain house. And the rancher told us before we set it afire to take off the doors and the windows, because if we later got caught, we couldn't be prosecuted for arson on a dwelling, because without doors and windows, it wasn't a dwelling."
A little more than a decade later, tourism rose again, and this time it was a motorized revival led by developer Robert Noble Burgess.
Robert Noble Burgess' big idea was to build homes all the way to the top of Mount Diablo. Diablo Estates, they were to be called. And he built North Gate Road and South Gate Road to access the summit. He was so proud of his roads that he advertised them as being suitable for auto racing. He wanted to preserve Rock City, the mountain's most famous picnic area today. But he didn't like the name. He gave it a new name. He called it Garden of the Jungle Gods. And he gave names to many of the rocks that persist today, Elephant Rock and Whale Rock and Butterfly Rock. But the crown gem of this project was to be a castle on top of Mount Diablo called Torre del Sol, which was to be remarkably similar to what was later to become Hearst Castle. And there was a good reason for that. William Randolph Hearst was his financial backer for this project. But neither the homes nor the castle were ever built. America got into World War I, and William Randolph Hearst became interested in that.
Burgess's dream of Mount Diablo Estates went bust during World War I. He went bankrupt, and Walter Frick acquired his property. But it was about this time that citizens and local community officials and politicians got together and began to agitate to start Mount Diablo State Park. And a bill was passed in the state legislature authorizing the creation of a park and even allocating a little bit of money. So on June 19th, 1921, everybody who was anybody showed up for the dedication. By the end of the 1920s, the legislature had passed a revenue bond to establish a California state park system. And then there was money to expand Mount Diablo from a few hundred acres to a few thousand acres. And again, that called for a ceremony, this time in April 1931 up at Rock City.
And this being the second year of the Great Depression, everybody decided they wanted to be at that big dedication. Even the governor of California, Sonny Jim Rolfe, decided he would come along. So on the morning of April 26th, 1931, people started to assemble at Rock City. 3 high school bands were bussed up and began playing. A contingent of rodeo riders from Livermore made their way up, and they were entertaining the assembled masses with their lariat tricks. A PA system was set up in eager anticipation of the dignitaries that would soon be motoring their way up the top. Early in the morning of Martinez, 600 cars assembled, led by Sonny Jim Rolfe. But by the time they had got from Martinez to Pacheco, it had actually started to sprinkle. By the time they got to Concord, it was raining, unmistakably. By the time they got to Walnut Creek, it was coming down cats and dogs. By the time they got to the bottom of Mount Diablo Scenic Highway, it was coming down coyotes and bobcats. It was some serious business. And just at that time, Mount Diablo let loose with some great thunder. And Sonny Jim Rolfe, who had been drinking, woke up with a start. He knew the National Guard, who was up at Rock City, going to give him a 21-gun salute. He thought that they had started without him. One of the folks in an adjoining car noted Sonny Jim was already drunk as a skunk. This wasn't going to be pleasant. So it was decided that rather than try to make their way up, they would retire to the grounds of the Diablo Country Club. And that's where they had their little ceremony. Well, the poor folks that were assembled up at Rock City, they had no choice. They had to wait out the deluge. Some of the cars up there had become mired in the mud, and that was a problem. They tried to push them out with man and woman power. That didn't work. All looked lost. And that's where the rodeo riders from Livermore came in handy. They lassoed the cars with their ropes, and they were able to pull them out to safety. And they made their way down. Anyway, it was all too much for the poor park warden. But he had just started, and next day he checked himself into Martinez Hospital in a state of near collapse. One of the participants up at Rock City said, "Well, all I can say is today Mount Diablo sure lived up to its name." And that was the story of the second dedication of Mount Diablo State Park.
The park thrived in the years that followed, greatly benefiting from one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC, as it was known, provided jobs to help families recovering from the Great Depression. Some 3 million men participated, and about 1,000 of them were stationed at Mount Diablo from 1934 to 1941. They built the visitor center on the summit, as well as roads, culverts, retaining walls, water supply systems, camping and picnic sites, and trails. The CCC also built the first stone barbecues at Live Oak Campground. Their design proved so popular that it was used in other state and even national parks. Around the same time the CCC was building park amenities, Mary Bauerman was cataloging its plants. She was one of botanist Willis Lynn Jepson's graduate students at the University of California at Berkeley. Bauerman said she was chosen to study Mount Diablo because she was the only botany student with a car. Well, she definitely proved herself up to the task. In 1944, she published The Flowering Plants and Ferns of Mount Diablo, a book that's still the Bible for botanists today. In the 1970s, she helped found both the Mount Diablo Interpretive Association, which fosters appreciation and enlightened use of the state park, and Save Mount Diablo, which has dramatically expanded protected land on and around the mountain. Bauerman began her Diablo research right after fires swept across 25,000 acres on the mountain in 1931.
Mary was an absolute expert in fire recovery because she had the years to watch it. And there were fires, huge fires, in the 30s and 40s and 70s on Mount Diablo.
After a fire in 1977, Dean Lesher of the Contra Costa Times raised money to replant the blackened slopes with Monterey pines. But Monterey pines don't grow on Mount Diablo. They're a non-native species and would have been unlikely to survive.
Mary was outraged. So she really tried to get professors there to talk about that it will restore itself. Yes, you need to deal with erosion and clear the creeks, but it will restore itself.
Eventually, Bauerman and Mount Diablo State Park used the money the newspaper had raised to build the Mary Bauerman Trail around the top of the mountain. Today, it's one of the park's most popular hikes. In less than a mile, it passes through forest, grassland, and chaparral habitats, with wide-angle views of northern and central California. The first 2/10 of a mile is wheelchair accessible. Through her work with Save Mount Diablo, Mary was directly involved in saving places on the mountain that many of us take for granted today. North Peak, Mitchell, Back, and Donner Canyons, Black Hawk Ridge, the Black Hills, and Sycamore Canyon, Pine Canyon and Castle Rock, White Canyon and Riggs Canyon.
She never got a job at a university as a botanist, but in her mid-60s, she created a conservation organization which would expand on her legacy in a way that affects the entire state of California and the Bay Area. You just have to give her incredible credit for starting something that's made such a huge difference to so many people.
When Walter Frick owned the western side of the mountain, he approved the building of a beacon on top, the standard Diablo Tower.
In the late 1920s, there was a move to popularize commercial aviation. But the problem was there was no radar back then, and to be profitable, planes had to fly at night, which was very difficult navigation. So the idea was hit upon to establish a series of beacons, lighthouses for aircraft. So on top of Mount Diablo, a 75-foot steel tower was built. And atop that tower was mounted a 10 million candle power beacon. And on the tower, giant letters SD were mounted. That stood for Standard Diablo. The Standard Oil Company was one of the financial contributors. I think the angle for them was they would be able to sell more aircraft fuel. But anyway, they needed a big celebrity to turn the light on, and the biggest one around at the time was Charles Lindbergh. And he sent a telegraph message to turn the light on. In April 1928, the beacon went on, and the light remained on for the next decade, braving brush fires and thunderstorms, until it was moved to the top of the new museum in 1939 as the museum neared completion. But then on December 7th, 1941, the park warden raced up to turn off the light because Pearl Harbor had just been bombed. And he was instructed to get that light off lest the Japanese Imperial Navy use the beacon on Mount Diablo to launch an invasion of the West Coast. After the war, well, there was radar, and you didn't need the the light anymore, so it remained off until 1964, when it was decided that turning the light on once a year on December 7th would be a great tribute to the Pearl Harbor survivors. On December 7th, 1964, retired Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz made the windy ride up to the top of Mount Diablo, and he lit the light for that first time. Then every year after that, on December 7th, the light is turned on.
Having served as Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II, Nimitz was perfect for the job. The light was also turned on in 2020 and 2021, when Save Mount Diablo lit it every Sunday night to honor the COVID-19 pandemic heroes and bring light into a dark time.
Mount Diablo is the northern sentinel, the northern anchor of the Diablo Range, part of the Inner Coast Mountain Range of California. It's also the backdrop to our everyday lives. Sometimes we're lucky enough to be there physically, and sometimes just in our minds.
The park has grown from 631 acres in 1921 to over 20,000 acres today. That's 20 times the size of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. State Park Supervising Ranger Cameron Morrison has worked here for more than 20 years, welcoming countless visitors and roaming the mountain's rugged terrain, from Mitchell Canyon Visitor Center at the base of the mountain to the 3,849-foot summit.
You've got some of the best views in California from Mount Diablo State Park. The highest elevation in Contra Costa County is found at the summit. We have over 160 miles of fire roads and trails. We have right around 500,000 people per year that visit Mount Diablo State Park, and many of those people are coming to the park to hike, to photograph, to enjoy the plants and wildlife. We have people that come here for recreation, riding their bicycles, trail running, camping.
The park has 3 campgrounds with 63 sites, as well as 5 group campsites. There are some rules, of course. Stay on established trails, ride bicycles only on paved roads, fire roads, and other designated trails. Don't bring a dog unless you'll be restricting your visit to a campground or other developed areas.
With the rest of California, Mount Diablo also has been impacted by climate change and droughts. Due to the drought over the last 2 years, our water reserves are extremely low.
In 2021, some of the springs the park depends on for water were drying up. In some places, trees were dying. Animals were stressed. But Mount Diablo State Park's size and diverse terrain, as well as a network of more than 100,000 acres of protected lands around it, act as a kind of insurance against the worst effects of climate change. They give plants and animals, including humans, room to roam.
Mount Diablo's changed a lot over time, but in a lot of ways, it's remained the same. The tule oak no longer graze the hillsides, the rainbow trout are gone from the creeks, and the grizzly bears are gone from the canyons, but the golden eagles are here in great numbers, and the peregrine falcons are here, and even the badgers are coming back. You never know what you're going to see on any given day. You might go out looking for a particular bird or plant, and you come around a bend in the trail and there's a beautiful flower or a shrub in bloom, or one of Mount Diablo's panoply of 8-legged, 6-legged, 4-legged, or even no-legged critters there sharing your space. Here we are in the midst of a busy urban area, and it's just a place where you can go to get lost, figuratively, not literally, from the everyday world and be amongst the flora and fauna of nature.